Welcome to yet another edition of ICANN Conversations. ICANN, or the India COVID Action Network, is designed to help the underprivileged communities which have been hit the hardest by this pandemic. ICANN is a unique network which connects the ones who are in need and the ones who can provide for it. Our ICANN warriors work from their homes, activating their ground network and mobilizing them for providing help. Till date, 5,339 needs have been registered on our portal, 2,295 needs have been closed, 1,06,224 lives have been impacted. This with the help of 4,014 warriors and 3,173 partner NGOs. As a part of the ICANN network, we have this thing called as the ICANN conversation. And today, uh, we have a unique topic to discuss, which is the perception of India globally post COVID 19 challenges and opportunities. And for sharing insights on this topic, we have with us Ambassador Vishnu Prakash. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash is a former envoy to Canada and South Korea and a spokesperson of Ministry of External Affairs. At present, he is a foreign affairs specialist, columnist, TV panelist, and a commentator on international affairs. Welcome to this conversation, sir.
Delighted to be on the program with you, and may I compliment you and India Can or I Can for initiating this wonderful platform or taking up these conversations on very important subjects. It's a timely initiative, and I'm very happy that I'm joining this platform today with you.
Thank you for your kind words, sir. So, I would like to begin this conversation by asking you how do you view this current unprecedented global pandemic, which has never been ever experienced by humanity?
Well, the world should have been prepared for this, but was not. I'm saying should because Bill, President Bush, the former President Bush, had warned the country, and in sometime in 2005, Bill Gates had cautioned the world about 5 years ago. But such is the practice that we kind of wake up only when we have to wake up. Never, as you said, has the world seen such a pandemic. The scale, the reach, the disruptiveness of this pandemic is unparalleled, and we are still in the throes of it. So and look at what it has done already. And Chancellor Angela Merkel, who chooses her words carefully, has very rightly said that it is the biggest challenge or crisis since the Second World War. And imagine in peace times, the world, the humanity has lost already almost 2,70,000 people, 2,65,000, and of which 80% in the developed world, which have the best of medical systems. The economies have gone for a toss, uh, and the way of life that we know has been disrupted. It has come to a virtual standstill. And I would dare say that the world, bruised, battered, and shocked world, which will emerge from this crisis, will never be the same again.
Sir, having been a diplomat and a foreign policy expert, you must have observed that different countries across the world responded to the pandemic differently. The Europe's response had been different, so has been the response of the United States of America. At the same time, we come to the eastern part of the world in a country like Korea, which was initially praised for the way it was managing the whole pandemic. Sir, what are your comments on this?
It is indeed a very pertinent question because practically every country has handled it differently for the simple reason there was no template, there was no playbook. And it was like blind people feeling and describing an elephant. So that is what the world has been doing. There are very few countries which understood the gravity of the situation or the enormity of the challenge and applied themselves. As somebody said that in most of the countries, the leaders left it to their number twos, uh, so that as if that was the best way to deal with it. But specifically, and we'll come to China a little later, uh, even New York Times has said that in any way you look at it, if there's one country which stands out from the rest, that is South Korea. And by the way, South Korea uh, in late February had the second largest number of COVID-19 cases in the world because it's a neighbor of China. The first infection was discovered on the 20th of January, and it has spiraled to almost 1,000 a day in late February. But by middle of March, in 15 days, they managed to beat back the crisis. I mean, amazing, phenomenal. Not only that, on the 15th of April, they conducted parliamentary elections and even brought the COVID positive cases to vote. I mean, this is, if you needed a tribute to democracy, that is one. Now, how did they do that? Their mantra was trace, test, and treat. They very meticulously went about locating not just the positive cases, but all those who are in contact. And what we need to understand is that one positive case which is not detected can literally affect uh, tens, if not hundreds of people. I mean, it's such a multiplier effect. And they tracked them, they isolated them, treated them, and tested. And the best part is that they brought technology to full use. And by the way, Korea is one of the most, or perhaps the most tech savvy country, digital savvy country in the world. 100% literacy, a very disciplined population. So it was a combination. And then, as President Moon Jae-in said, two things were very important. One is transparency. They were completely upfront with the nation. And secondly is the confidence of the people. If the people have confidence in the leadership, things happen. Now, Japan, again, a country that I've served in, it's a great country. They somehow stumbled. They handled it well initially, but they did not enforce social distancing. And as a result, again, it flared up. Germany in Europe has been one of the most successful countries in handling the crisis because they enforced social distancing, they went in for testing. Chancellor Angela Merkel took the lead. And then some other countries like, or entities like Taiwan, like Singapore, Vietnam, have done quite well. And here I would like to also add, while keeping my finger crossed, that India stands out.
Sir, what do you make of the US President Donald Trump, who commented that saving the economy was more important than saving lives?
Well, I don't want to comment on what he said, but let us turn the searchlight inwards, and it is something which is worth very seriously reflecting on. Goes without saying that human lives come first, and every effort has to be made to save human lives. But it so happens that humans, have needs. They have the necessities. They need to eat. They need to be housed. They need to breathe. Now, a stage comes, and that is the challenge that we are facing in this country, our country today, is where do you draw a line? And at times there's a toss up between living and livelihood. So even living is put to danger if you do not have livelihood or means of living. So that is the big challenge that many countries face. Some countries get it right, some countries do not get it right. And we are, and today, as we speak, the nation is confronted, the leadership is confronted with this challenge because, the virus or the crisis has meant, the numbers are disturbing, that 400 million people in the world, 1.5 billion people, 150 crore people in the world And we are talking of a global population of 7.7 billion. 1.5 billion have lost out on their livelihoods. Either they've lost their jobs or they've taken a pay cut. So that is the scale of the economic distress. And we have seen some glimpses of this despite a Herculean effort made by the government. And India is a very large country. So that is the big challenge. And uh, I have nobody has a very clear answer as to how to cope with it because the scale of this challenge is so humongous that one has to weigh everything, pros and cons, and perhaps at times you have to do things which you would have not done under the normal circumstances because these are not normal circumstances.
So, talking about the scale of the challenge, uh, one of the most important points or one of the most important questions which comes to the mind of a normal person is the role of the Chinese government in this or the Chinese state. So, there have been articles which have been written on this, that has China done enough, or could China have done more to put a stop on the spread of this pandemic. At the same time, even the role of the World Health Organization has come out to be very controversial, and the WHO has been accused of towing the line of the Chinese state. So, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, you have hit the nail in the head. And certainly, this is a very pertinent question, but also it's a sensitive question. I'm saying sensitive not for us so much, but for China, because the way China has been reacting to any suggestion which goes contrary to the narrative that they want to put out. And by the way, it's a constructive narrative, constructed narrative, or even a manufactured narrative. They have been lashing out in a manner that is unprecedented. But that we will take up a moment later. It is not the first time, and I'm afraid it is not going to be the last time when these deadly viruses have originated from China. The SARS virus originated in 2002, 2003. And again, there was a delay in informing the world, but it was brought under control. This time, if we were to recall what happened, the sequence of events, which now are being ignored or being covered up by China because they are putting out, as I said, a different narrative, is that at the minimum, in Wuhan, China, in Hubei province, the virus was discovered by mid-November. It was covered up. Now, I'm not even getting into that who covered it up, local officials, regional officials, whatever. And for almost 6 weeks, things continued as normal. Now, why am I saying that is that it is worth recalling or underlining that China has 5.5 crore, sorry, uh, 550 crore people, 5.5 billion people who travel within China every year. So basically, 45 crore people travel every month within China. So 6 weeks, about 80 crore people would have traveled all across China, and again, tens of millions across the world. And from so in during those 6 weeks, the virus multiplied, virus spread, but they kept a lid on it. 31st of December, they informed WHO, but they do not care to inform the world. And again, by the time the world is informed, it is towards the third week of January. Now, and then look at the audacity. China wants to brush this all under the carpet, wants to, in fact, their spokesperson tried to blame US soldiers for bringing it to Wuhan, the virus to Wuhan. And they want a pat on the back. They want to be commended for literally saving the world because they send medical supplies. We all know, including India, that the medical supplies, lots of it were faulty. They were substandard. But that's a minor detail. So, in this constructed narrative, as I like to call it, they want to be seen as a benefactor, which is contrary to fact. So, that has been, unfortunately, the role of China. It is the second largest economy. It is a military power. It's a power which wants to have develop a China-centric world, which is will be different from the democratic order, rule-based international order that we are used to. So that is the scale of the challenge. That is the scale of the problem confronting the world. And about WHO, less said the better. Imagine the DG of WHO goes to Beijing in early January. What is the role of the World Health Organization? It is important to see how they conducted themselves during 2002 2003 when the SARS virus broke out. They conducted an investigation. They led from the front. They cautioned the world about the challenge. They issued advisories. Now here the DG goes to China and basically speaks on behalf of China, giving a good conduct certificate, crediting China for transparency. I mean, he just reads the Chinese script. So, if you have to read the Chinese script, may I very respectfully ask through you, the world leaders, why do we need an international body which is supposed to be independent? And there are good reasons for that, or there are pointers to why this has been done, but that may be later. Short point is that WHO has failed the world, and in fact, for that matter, international organizations, the global governance structure, architecture has become outdated. The United Nations has proven to be ineffective. uh, it is it has been stalemated because the UN Security Council in March, when China was the chair, did not even take up the matter of coronavirus because China would veto that. And Dr. Jaishankar, our external affairs minister, speaking in February this year, said, I quote, "The United Nations is far less credible today than it has been through its history." So that is unfortunately the facts and the sad truth which is confronting the humanity in its face.
Sir, we have a live audience on Facebook, and there are many of them who are putting up questions.
I'll be very
So,
happy to take the questions. In fact, thank you. I leave it to your judgment. Let's take the questions that you deem appropriate and then we can continue our conversation.
you were just talking about China, and there is Vibhas Amuvate who asks, can it be called economic terrorism by China?
Well, China is a major country. It's a big power. It is our immediate neighbor. We have a 4,000 kilometer long border with China. We have an unresolved boundary issue. We have a number of concerns. We want to engage with China. And so does the world. So I think instead of putting labels, we should look at facts. Facts are that China has gradually become the world's factory. And all the global supply chains originate from or lead to China. That's a fact. China has accumulated huge foreign exchange reserves of today of more than $3 trillion, although it was four at one point in time. Now, what has been the result? The result has been that the world has woken up one fine morning. Waking up happened a few years ago, but the enormity of the situation dawned only now, that there is total, in some cases, total over dependence on China in critical areas. Let me substantiate. The US, which is the biggest power in the world, is dependent on China for 97% of APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients. 97%. So imagine if the supply chain gets disrupted, US will not have medication. Let's pause and reflect on that. India, which is the pharmacy of the world, is dependent on Chinese supplies to the extent of more than 60%. Today, India is supplying not just range of key pharmaceutical products like hydroxychloroquine, etc., but paracetamol. Paracetamol, which is available for 10 rupees a strip in India, because a country like UK reached out to India saying we do not have paracetamol. And the certainly what has happened is in the bargain, willy-nilly, the world has given China a huge economic leverage. And they are not averse to using the leverage as a coercive leverage. And so much so that it sends a shiver down my spine to recall that on the 4th of March, Xinhua, which is the official news agency of China, and I mean, anything written in Xinhua is said to be reflective of the government's and the party's view. Xinhua, and I'm paraphrasing it, I don't know whether I can pull out that quote. Yes, I think I can. Xinhua writes, and I'm quoting from that article, if China retaliates against the US by imposing a travel ban as also strategic control and bans export of medical products, then the US will fall into the hell of a new pneumonia epidemic. Will fall into the hell of the new pneumonia epidemic. The US owes China an apology and the world owes China a gratitude. The world owes China gratitude because of the coronavirus having been gifted which originated in Wuhan and which has consumed 265,000 lives. The world owes China an apology. So this is just stating facts. I leave it to our learned viewers and listeners to draw the conclusions. But I think it's a wake-up call for the world. And as I said in my opening remarks, the world will never be the same again.
So, talking about the wake-up call, uh, will there be any sanctions which will be imposed on China by international organizations post COVID-19 as the world recovers from it? And my supplementary question to this would be, regardless of international sanctions or sanctions by a certain country, won't the citizens be or the individuals be wary about China and try to abstain from buying China-made products?
Uh, Very important questions. Let me mention another parallel, not a parallel, but something that has always stayed with me. So I think somewhere in South India, I read a report about 2 years ago. A person who had taken a bribe of 50 rupees was hounded for 10 years. And after 10 years, he was penalized for an X amount. He had taken a bribe for 50 rupees. There are economic offenders who have robbed the country of thousands of millions of dollars and have absconded and have acquired safe havens and they're leading a king's life. So that is how equal the world is. And that is how equal the international order is. When, although supposedly all countries are equal, unfortunately, my friend, as some people are more equal than the others, similarly, some countries are more equal than the other. And when you are a large country, you are a permanent member of the UN Security Council, uh, you behave in a way, you pay lip service to respecting international order, but then you are a law unto yourself. And the case in point is how China has dismissed the award of the International Court of Arbitration in the case of Philippines in the South China Sea. They had taken over forcibly this the some what I'm forgetting the name. I'll momentarily recall that squalls of Philippines, Scarborough Shoal, I think, as far as I remember, and Philippines then went to the International Court of Arbitration, who said that China illegally occupied it and do not have a right of over 70% of South China Sea, and that was absolutely ignored. So that is how big powers act, and China is acting. So that is one. As far as the fear of Chinese goods is concerned, that is for real. I think, in Korea when there was this huge scandal of tainted baby milk formula in China, and babies were dying because somebody had started selling contaminated milk powder. So this is happening again and again. And today the world and people certainly, there is bound to be a backlash. There is bound to be a decoupling. I already hear isolated voices saying, or isolated voices saying, look, we are not going to buy Chinese goods. And maybe that will pick up, because cheap Chinese goods are like a narcotic. It hooks you. But when you need them, they are not available. And that is where the coercive power comes in. And I think that gradually, at least for strategic goods, sensitive goods, critical goods in the or material products in the healthcare sector, in the food in the food edible food items, uh, IT, telecom, defense, etc., there will be a gradual decoupling, and units, uh, international companies will shift out their units from China, and there will be a fall in demand of Chinese goods and materials for especially in these sectors. That I think is bound to happen.
Sir, and talking about China and the Chinese response to the pandemic, how do you look at India's response? Especially internationally, uh, we have heard about the criticism coming on Mr. Narendra Modi for allowing the supply of HCQs internationally to Europe, to African countries, to United States of America. So this HCQ diplomacy, what does it mean for India?
I'm so happy that you asked that question. Let me draw your attention to a survey which was done recently. I think it was done in the last week of April, perhaps, or in the third week of April, and opinion poll, according to which 93%, and I repeat, 93% of the countrymen support the actions of the government in handling the coronavirus. Now, let's pause and reflect on that. We are the biggest democracy in the world. We are one of the most critical people in the world. We are one of the most argumentative people in the world. And we have a huge sense of entitlement. We demand from the government, but forget that the government also demands something from the citizens. But that's a different issue, and we could talk about it when if we were to discuss the behavior of a microscopic percentage of India's population, which needs to be corrected. Now, with that kind of a support, it's obvious that government is doing something right. And I'm very happy to say, as somebody who follows India closely and the world, is that uh, our government has been ahead of the curve. We were the first to one of the first to cancel visas issued to the Chinese, to impose restrictions on travel to China, ban Chinese flights coming into India from China, extended it to other countries. introduced quarantine, closed our airspace, and from the 25th of March, the biggest ever lockdown known to mankind was introduced. Now, and today we are manufacturing our own PPPs, our rapid test kits, and so on. So that has been the performance of India internally. Now, let's talk of the hydroxychloroquine. As I said, India is the pharmacy of the world. We have been supplying medication to any and every country in the world. But what have we done? Have we deprived of our own citizens? Every country will first take on board its own needs. And when you have some more, you have a choice either to hoard, as some countries do, or to make a quick buck, as some countries do, or say that, look, I am a responsible member of the Committee of Nations. I'm going to share it with my neighbors and friends and even people I do not, I have difficulties with. And here the case in point is that we even supplied hydroxychloroquine to Malaysia, which had said things and done things which were unusual. So I would respectfully disagree with this question that we deprived ourselves. We have been a very responsible member of the Committee of Nations. I would like to recall that our Prime Minister took the initiative to have the first ever virtual SAARC conference. He was the person who called for the first G20 summit. So that I think shows where India is. The similarity between India and certain other countries is as similar to chalk and cheese.
So my next question would deal with our dependence on China. So you spoke about how India has started manufacturing PPEs and testing kits, but eventually there are companies which are leaving China. For example, the Japanese government is giving an incentive to the Japanese companies to come back to Japan and leave China. Similarly, we have had a lot of chief ministers in India, most vocally the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, who has made it clear that he would be interested in helping out companies who would like to move back to India from China. So, do we see that happening? One, India's reduced dependence on China. Second, global manufacturers coming and choosing India in place of China.
I think this is $1 million question, and I would suspect that I would like to believe, and indications are that after the challenge of coronavirus, the second biggest issue that the government of India is looking at is precisely what you have pointed towards. First, our own dependence on China. We have $100 billion trade with China and a $60 billion, roughly, I'm rounding up figures, $60 billion trade deficit. So this is politically untenable, and we need to correct that. Unfortunately, barring a few manufactured items like auto components, pharmaceutical products, gems and jewelry, uh, give and take a few other sectors, textiles, although textiles also we have slipped. We are still a primary export, we are an exporter of primary goods. Now, why so? It is because we did not industrialize. We lost out on the industrial revolution, and our industrial base is narrow, contributing about 16% of our GDP from industry and manufacturing sector, whereas it should be at least 26, 27%. So that is a challenge. Now, when you have a country like India, aspirational country, young country, fast developing economy, people who are educated, who travel, they need quality goods and services. Now, if you do not have goods and the people need, what do? You have only two choices: either manufacture in India or import. So, frankly, we have reached a stage where we have no choice for our own good. but to expand our manufacturing base. And that is where the initiative of the Prime Minister came in of Make in India. And it has, I think, created a buzz or to sensitize people about the requirement of expanding the manufacturing base, although it has not attracted the kind of industry that we were wanting because of challenges. And those challenges, what I call, this is perhaps the best opportunity, and these opportunities will never come again or will not come again in our lifetime, of introducing Make in India 2.0 and bring in the necessary reforms opening so that India becomes a definitely more attractive place for investments. And here I don't think it is any rocket science, it is very well known. We need taxation reforms, we want labor reforms, we need land reforms. We have to get bureaucrats like me out of the way. And we have to improve ease of doing business. I mean, compliments to this government that in 5 years we rose from 144 or 142 in ease of doing business to 63. Amazing job done. But what does it also mean? Sorry, that 62 countries are still ahead of us. And we need to take care of that. So, and the world is today looking at India, Vietnam, some other countries because we are a democracy. We are not, there is no clash of interests that other countries and India have. It is unique that the world wants to see the rise of India. So this is an opportune time, and I hope that American companies I know are keen to come to India. Korean companies are, Japanese companies are. It's a good time, and indications are that the government is looking at a package, and I hope we do that for the sake of our own nation, because first you need to take care of your own requirements so that we cut down on import dependence, we improve our trade balance sheet, and also we become an important link in the regional supply chains, because the supply chains will shrink from global to regional and sub-regional. And that is where India can play a very important role. I am optimistic, but we need to take the necessary decisions boldly. And if one government can do that, it is this government. So, such is my belief.
Sir, two of our Facebook viewers have a similar question, Vishal Ghosh and Sohini Nath. They are asking you to elaborate on India's strategy dealing with China, especially in terms of economics in a post-COVID world.
I couldn't get the question. Can you read? Can you?
So they want to know what will be India's strategy in dealing with China, with special regards to economics in a post-COVID
Yeah,
world.
yeah. I think I have already mentioned that. But let me quickly reiterate it. India wants, let me say it categorically, as a person who has served in China, who has been following this region for 25 years. India wants to have a working relationship with China. There was a time when the Chinese leaders used to say about 15 years ago that the world is large enough to accommodate the aspirations of two rising powers, India and China. That is the kind of world order or regional order that we would like. We would, if we can, if there's a paradigm which allows us to work closely, to compete, to collaborate, because competition is healthy. That is the kind of world order that we would like, or regional order that we like. And we would like to have cordial relations, working relations. But the problem is that China wants to be a preeminent power, and it is an expansionist power. It has, we know the relations between China and Pakistan. We know how Pakistan is being used as a frontline state by China. how all our strategic interests are ignored. Even listing of Masood Azhar as a global terrorist was held up for 10 years because of China. So that is the kind of role that China has been playing hitherto. We do hope that China kind of reconsiders this. And that goes without saying that we have to reduce our dependence on China. We cannot, a $60 billion trade uh, deficit is unsustainable. We would like to have normal trade and commerce with China, but let me my last comment in this on this question is that the challenge is that China is not a market economy. India is a market economy. And one of the things which the world has come to regret is that in 2001, China was admitted in the World Trading Organization (WTO) as a semi-market economy in the hope that they will open up. So what has happened is just to the contrary. You cannot have a situation where one side plays by the book and the other side does not. So while wanting to engage China, and continuing to engage China, we have also looked at our interests because any country, domestic policy or foreign policy is to safeguard its national interests. And India will also do that, hopefully together with China. And if we have to, along with other countries. But let me again say that we are very keen to engage with China because it's in our national interest. China is a major power. You cannot contain a major power. You cannot ignore a major power.
Sir, Apurva Pandit from Facebook has this question for you. He asks, has the coronavirus brought Europe, US, and India much closer than they were? And then a supplementary question is this a beginning of a new strategic, political, as well as economic alliance?
Very good question. My compliments. Uh, the geopolitical or geostrategic world order will change. There is no doubt about it. There will be a new architecture, a new security architecture, because NATO has a security architecture. We do not in Asia, do not have it. Hitherto, that security architecture was, in a way, USA was the net security provider. Today, US's role is, there's a question mark over it. Hitherto, the world looked up to US for leadership, at least the democratic world did. USA has turned inwards or turning inwards. So there is a kind of a, I will not say vacuum because I don't like the word vacuum, but there is a kind of a gap that is opened up. Now that needs to be filled. What will happen in Asia, in my view, is that countries will look inwards and towards their friends in the region to beef up their security and defense outlook. They will be perhaps they will start acquiring defense platforms. So we may see an arms race. Countries are certain countries which had the security umbrella from of the US, for example, Korea, Japan, are worried today. So that is the big challenge. Europe is divided. And also the fact remains that Europe has looks more at economic issues than security and defense issues, because one thing where President Trump is right is that the US expenditure on defense and security in some cases is less than even 1% of GDP. So those are the kind of challenges that we face. There are no ready answers. There are no easy answers. But at the end of the day, a like-minded countries, including the US, including some countries in Europe, and if you want to name it, two countries come to my mind are France and Germany. In India, countries like, or in Asia, countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Vietnam to a lesser extent, uh, Indonesia, India, are more or less like-minded countries which can come together on a common platform, which will have enough economic heft, size, and at least speak in one language that can be uh, on any subject, economic or political or security or strategic. And that should have an impact because that may set the tone for other countries to follow. I am being guarded in my response because we are what we look at as A, we are not yet out of the coronavirus crisis. B, this is a very serious dislocation that has happened, and everything is up for grabs, or everything is up in the air. How it will pan out, there are nobody, at least I cannot say for sure.
Sir, Ajay Kumrawat from Facebook is asking you a question. He asks, do we see a greater role of India in Africa?
India has always had a historical relationship with Africa. As far as I know, uh, there are I forget the figure now offhand, but there are millions of people of Indian origin in Africa. South Africa is very fond of saying that India sent them a Gandhi, they sent back a Mahatma. And India has historically, Indo-Africans have been taking a lead in trade, commerce, education, and so on. We have a ITEC program, India Technical and Economic Cooperation Program, which was initiated in somewhere in 1950s when we had just about become independent. And we have always been sharing our developmental experience with Africa. So I think we have a fund of goodwill in Africa. India has a lot of commands a lot of respect. Indian teachers, for example, are held in great deal of respect. And we have Indian industry, Indian investors who are working in Africa. So that is the kind of balance sheet that we have, and we would very much like to scale up that cooperation. Now, the challenge is that Africa is a continent which needs the investment dollar. Their need for foreign investments is huge. And that is where China has come in through BRI, Belt Road Initiative. And they have been pumping money into Africa. Initially, that money was taken with a lot of enthusiasm, and now many African countries and other countries have turned around and found that they have been caught in a cobweb, in a web of debt. And because some countries were cajoled into, or some countries which may not be representative countries, they engage in vanity projects, huge vanity projects which does not give you any returns. So there is a concern that now African countries, some of them at least, have towards China. Our challenge is we have a lot of respect. We have, and we have, by the way, the India-Africa Cooperation Program, wherein under we are investing billions of dollars in Africa. So I think uh, I have given a long answer to this question just to put it in perspective that there is a very good scope for scaling up our engagement, or India's footprint in Africa will grow. The only challenge is the economic challenge, because India will have to tie up with friendly countries like Japan and other countries to bring in greater investments in Africa to play a bigger and a more meaningful role.
Sir, I would take the liberty to ask you one question, which is not really specifically related to our topic today, but a couple of our viewers have asked this question.
By all means, if I know the answer, I will.
So they are asking with regards to India's assertiveness with regards to the Gilgit-Baltistan region. So they are saying India has never ever been so assertive with regards to Gilgit-Baltistan. So what are your views on this new approach to Gilgit-Baltistan by the Indian state?
India is a country which has been proud of the fact that we have always played by the book. We have a reputation for that, for being have we have it is recognized that we have never violated an international convention. We have always upheld any and every agreement that we have concluded, whether bilateral, regional, or global. Now, that is India's position. As far as the state of Jammu and Kashmir is concerned, that's an integral part of India. That has been it's and that has been reiterated several times. Unfortunately, there is a part of Jammu and Kashmir which is under the illegal occupation of Pakistan, and that is a part of the unfinished agenda. That is Indian territory. Part of that in 1966 was illegally ceded to China. Uh, but as I said, it is our territory, and we will do everything within the laws of the international laws to to reclaim or to have Jammu and Kashmir as a integral whole, united whole, as a part of as a member state of the country.
Sir, I'll come to the last question then.
Yeah.
Sir, the last question is, how will the world look at India in a post-corona world? I mean, will India emerge stronger after corona?
You know, as I see it, the corona crisis will produce only losers. There'll be no winners. And in my book, China will be the biggest loser. And we have touched upon that. We have reflected on that to an extent. Now, the other countries which come out relatively unscathed, every country is affected. It's a global crisis. Every country is affected. India is also affected. But those countries which emerge relatively unscathed or less bruised have will have an edge over the others. It is earnestly hoped and at least that is what indications are, that India should hopefully be one such country. In fact, I am at times disappointed by the comparisons with other countries saying, "Oh, India has had so many COVID cases. Such a country has so many COVID cases." I mean, how can you compare, for example, South Korea, which has 51 million people, and India, which has got only 1.35 billion people, or Japan, which has got 120 million people. So, I mean, you have to compare the comparables. Given the size of India, so far we are doing very well. I hope that we manage to uh, flatten the curve. And on the premise that we do so, I think this will open up an opportunity for India to march ahead confidently to achieve its destination. We were already projected to be the third largest economy in the world, a $10 trillion economy by mid 30s. Hopefully, we may be able to scale up that. And mind you, the difference between India and other countries, as I said, is that India has always been playing a constructive role. Even in South Asia and in the Asian region, in the Indo-Pacific region, we are seen as a net security provider. Coup in Maldives, we are there. Tsunami which has affected Indonesia, we are there. A neighborhood, we are there. So even when there was unfortunate incident of nuclear incident in Fukushima, we reached out to our Japanese friends in a small way that we could. In the third, fourth week of February, we sent a aircraft plane load of medical supplies even to China. So we are seen as a country which is constructive. We are the world, one of the world leaders in peacekeeping operations. We are a large economy. We have more than 30 million strong diaspora in the world, which is playing an important role. So we have all the attributes, and we are the largest democracy. We have all the attributes which should enable India to play a befitting role. And I think that provided India emerges with relatively unscathed from the virus, this will be the time for India to play its rightful role in the Committee of Nations.
Thank you, sir. Uh, on this note, we'll end today's conversation. Once again, I'll thank you, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, sir, for taking out time and being a part of today's ICANN conversation. It was indeed a very fruitful conversation, and I hope the audience gained a lot of new perspectives through this dialogue.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I would like to thank the participants today who have posed such searching questions. And I hope that your platform attracts even greater participation, because in these times, difficult times, you are bringing a conversation which is very relevant and important to your viewers and listeners. All the best to you, and thank you for inviting me to the platform.
Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank